Thank you for making it out here, and welcome to the quorum. We're delighted to be hosting this conversation tonight. A Sixth of Humanity is a sweeping, deeply researched account of India's post-independence development journey, economic, political, social, and institutional over the last 75 years. The title reflects the fact that India is home to 1/6 of the world's population, making its development path one of the most consequential in modern history. I don't think anyone needs to know that there's a lot at stake, not only for us, but I think for the world as well. This book brings together the combined intellectual force of its two esteemed authors. Arvind Subramanian is a leading economist and former chief economic advisor to the Government of India. He's currently a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Devesh Kapur, his co-author, is a distinguished scholar of South Asian Studies and director of Asia Programs and Star Foundation professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Guiding today's discussion is Dr. Rathin Roy, who's not only a friend of the quorum, is a respected economist, a professor whose work spans public policy, macroeconomics, and development. Amongst his many accolades, he was also served as Prime Minister Modi's Economic Advisory Council. I was joking with Rathin earlier today, saying it was a short stint, but I was told that it was a 2.5-year stint, so he said it was in fact, it was a long stint and not a short stint. But without further ado, I'd like to invite our speakers over. Please enjoy the evening. The book is available for sale, so I would recommend you pick a copy, and we would have the authors maybe even sign it for you. But I'd get out of your way, and gentlemen, over to you. Please enjoy your evening.
Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to this evening's discussion, which promises to be enjoyable. And we are lucky that we are getting our two distinguished colleagues here to speak to us well before they go into the grind of the Delhi Darbar, which would have broken them down, both, sort of in terms of conversation, I suppose, pollution. So they've sensibly done the high per capita parts of the country first, before moving on to Delhi, for which I'm very grateful. What I propose to do is request both of you to speak ad lib about the book and what you think is, this is a corporate city, so what do you think are the 3 or 4 most important messages that you wish to convey to the audience for them to reflect on and then respond to you, right? And then I'll move on to a couple of sort of segue questions to you, or comments or challenges. I haven't made up my mind yet, and then we'll throw it open. So hopefully we'll have an interesting evening. Please do ask anything you feel you wish to ask, because I've noticed with these two guys, who I have known for a long time, they respond much better the more provocative the question is. So we'll get our money's worth out of them if you ask them provocative and interesting questions. They seem to like it, although they, of course, disclaim that. Okay, so which of you wants to go first?
I thought what we'd plan is we talk a little bit about the book, sure, and then tell you maybe 3 or 4, or not so much key as the surprises that we encountered.
Even better.
Yeah, and what the kind of some themes that we draw out. Excellent. But Devesh will begin.
You all love surprises, right? So be prepared to be surprised.
Thank you, Rathin. Thank you all for being here. What we thought was I'll just sort of give you a broad overview of how we thought about this book. Some surprising findings, at least we were surprised. And then, for lack of a better word, some persistent pathologies that we noticed over the 75 years. So I think there are probably 4 central distinctive aspects of the book. One is we see the development as necessarily something to be approached through an interdisciplinary approach. Arvind is an economist, I'm a political scientist. I was an engineer but I became a political scientist. And the idea is, of course, that we didn't want to examine India's development story through the silos of one specific discipline. We all know politics affects economics, economics affects politics. You cannot artificially separate the two. A second distinctive feature, at least the way we saw it, is that we came to this book without strong priors. And we were determined to tell this story through the data. So we spent enormous amounts of effort. We put together a database and we actually read about 3,000 official government reports over 7 decades. And through that, we put together the data on hundreds of variables and then have told the story through the data rather than looked for data from priors. A third sort of feature which came through by reading all these literally thousands of reports was we did not want to make judgments on what happened in different periods of time with the hindsight of history. It's very easy to be wise now looking back, but I think it's important to understand why certain choices were made at that time. What were the challenges they were facing? What was the information they had? Rather than from what we call the condescension of posterity. A fourth feature of the book is that it is comparative. It is comparative in several ways. It's comparative across India, looking at the different states. It's comparative over time. It's comparative in comparing India with similar large countries, and in particular, of course, China. But we also have a different way in which we think about comparison, what we call development time. You know, it makes no sense comparing India with the US today. US is a much, much richer country. But it might be more interesting to compare, say, the American state with the Indian state when the US had a similar per capita income that India has now, which was, of course, in the late 19th century. And in the late 19th century, you know, it was pretty inept, pretty corrupt, something it has again managed to come back to, but that's a separate story. So what were some of the surprises that we found? We're going to list you 6. I'm going to talk about 3, and Arvind will to talk about 3. The first was one of the absolute prerequisites of development for any country is you have to establish order. Without order, with order, you may or may not get a development. But without order, you certainly will not. You just have to go to Bihar. So one of the surprising things was, if you look at the processes of nation building, India has had among the least amounts of mass violence of any large country in the world, by far. It is a complete outlier. And this might surprise you all because, of course, every day we open the papers and we see X, Y, and Z, you know, riots, murders, this, that. But that's micro-violence. Mass violence is like the American Civil War. 2% of the population is killed. When you apply that to India, that's 30 million people. The French Revolution, the British Civil War, China in the 50s and 60s, 40 to 50 million people killed. The Korean, the Taiwanese, the Indonesian, all these experiences, this is what mass violence was. Other than partition, which basically is the violence just around independence, not after independence, not in the process of nation building. Actually, India, the surprising thing about India is not that it has had too much violence, but it has had too little violence. Now, we contrast this, of course, as we think about order, a different way in which, for economists, we think about disorder is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a manifestation of extreme economic disorder. Here, too, India is very distinctive when you compare India with comparable countries, whether Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, China, etc., is how much India has avoided hyperinflation compared to other similar countries. So one of the surprising things about our story was that macro order, India established that, and we argue that it established that with such little either hyperinflation or mass violence because it chose to become democratic very early. India is a complete outlier among countries in the low level of income and low literacy at which it gave universal franchise. Now, that had other negative effects on the economy, which we can talk about, but it had a very positive effect on nation building without mass violence. State building and nation building universally is accompanied by violence, period. The fact that India managed to do so is something that is really distinctive, and I think how much we underappreciate that accomplishment. A second thing that we were surprised was when we look at state-owned enterprises. And we know the story, the Nehruvian period, public sector undertakings, how costly they were. Okay. So one of the things, there are two things that were really stand out. I think for the first time we put together data on all public sector enterprises and their financials, the central government. We could not do it for the states because in many states, the accounts just do not even exist. They are that bad. But if you looked at what we could put together, the public sector enterprises cost between 1.5% to 2.5% of GDP in terms of the opportunity cost. So basically what we do is we have the GSEC rate, which is the government borrowing rate, and we look at the rate of return on public sector enterprises relative to the government's borrowing rate, and that we call the opportunity cost. So it was 1.5 to 2.5% every year for 50 years. To put it in perspective, the states could have doubled their healthcare expenditure if the public enterprises, state public enterprises, did not bleed as much red ink, and the central government could have spent almost 100% more in infrastructure every year over the past half century. That was how expensive it was. But it's not correct to believe that this infatuation with public sector enterprises is in the past. In the Nehruvian era, we set up 70 new public sector enterprises. Under Prime Minister Modi, we set up 84. In the Nehruvian era,
70 under Nehru?
84
under Modi.
Yeah. In the Nehruvian era, the expenditure, capital expenditure on public sector enterprises was 1 lakh crore in real 2024 rupees. In the Modi years, it's 22 lakh crores in real 2024 rupees. Of course, as a fraction of GDP, it's less because the GDP is much more. And it is also the case that in the Nehruvian era, most of the enterprises that were set up were in manufacturing. Whereas what has happened in the Modi era, they are in two areas basically, energy and infrastructure. That's the difference. But we still spend enormous amounts of money on bleeding public sector enterprises. Between 2019 and 2023, the Indian government spent 322,000 crores, $40 billion to rescue BSNL and MTNL. When you already have, two excellent telecom private companies, and there is absolutely no way that BSNL or MTNL are going to do great things in the future. The difference you find is when central public sector enterprises were being set up in the Nehruvian years, there are enormous debates in parliament. When 325,000 crores is spent, nobody objects. Whether the opposition, whether the ruling party, it barely gets a mention. So that's the second surprise. The third surprise was on the structure of the Indian state. So we generally believe that India is very centralized in the sense of the relationship between Delhi and the states. So what we call the relationship between tier 1 and tier 2 of government. But when you compare the three largest countries in the world, China, India, and the United States, China and the United States, with very distinctive political regimes, are pretty identical in that most government employees are at the federal level or at the local level. India is exactly the opposite. The vast majority of government employees are at the state level. Therefore, it's not surprising that some of the biggest failures of the Indian state, which is the weak provision of local public goods, is because the third tier of government has been systematically starved of resources in stark contrast to other comparative countries. I'll turn it now to Arvind.
Yeah. So just to add to the surprises, I'll give you three quick surprises and then end with one or two what we call pathologies of the Indian, not just state but society and things. Just to add to one point to what Devesh said about why we wrote this book is that he's a political scientist, I'm an economist, but we fundamentally believed that to understand the Indian development experience, you had to understand that this new fledgling country was simultaneously trying to undertake four transformations. One is to reconfigure the colonial state into a development state, so state building, to create a sense of nationhood. It's so difficult, this diverse, complex polity and society, a sense of nationhood had to be built, which is no easy task. As we've discovered, so many countries have disintegrated. It had to create a market. It had to create, it had to transform society because so many things about Indian society deserved transformation. And all this had to be done through democratic politics. And so that's the reason why we have this, partly the reason why this book is so long, also for this comprehensive approach, because we think development is much more comprehensive than either just politics or economics. Now, the fourth surprise I want to give you is something we discovered is that when we were looking at the states, we discovered that 1/3 of India by population grew almost as fast as China and almost as long since 1980. This was a stunning fact which we didn't know. And basically these states are the southern states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, the western states, and Haryana. So once you see this fact,
You're saying they grew as fast as China.
yeah, and for almost as long and almost as fast,
How much? 30 years.
1980 to 2020, so about 35 to 40 years.
So you're saying Peninsular India,
Yeah,
plus Haryana,
yeah, grew all, yeah.
like China.
Like China, yeah. So, so the question of, the lament we always have, oh, why don't we do as well as China? By the way, this is on growth. I'm not saying this is on the Human Development Index and things like that, which we'll come to later. Is that the lament that, oh, why can't we do, the fondness that autocrats and people have, oh, I wish we were not a democracy, we'd be like China. That question has to be reframed, because it's not that India cannot grow as China, it's only 2/3 of India cannot grow as fast as the 1/3 of India, which has grown as fast as China. So it gives a different perspective. It forces us to look inwards, in addition to looking outwards. So that's one kind of surprise. The second surprise is, I would say, that, and Rathin is very au fait with this, it came as a complete surprise to us. Between 1990 and 2020, the last 30, 40 years, in the period when India grew rapidly compared to most other countries, probably the 7th or 8th fastest. We will come to the data later, but trust me, I've looked. With this data we've done carefully. What we find is that compared to most other countries like India, emerging market countries, India had the highest fiscal deficit of all the countries. And this was in excess of almost 10% of GDP every year for 30, 35 years. And we go into why that's the case. It has to do something with, yeah? The fiscal deficit is how much the government collects by way of taxes compared to how much it spends. That is the deficit. And it's how much it borrows broadly, yeah? Yeah, exactly.
Center and states, right? You're saying the collective.
Combined, yeah. And we do the comparison like for like, combined for all other states as well. So India has been a very vulnerable fiscal state, and we argue to some extent, we call this the Kamadhenu democracy, as it were, because, people think of India as kind of driven by a few vested interests. The point is that democracy is such a beautiful, accommodator of not just few vested interests, but many, many vested interests, on the tax side and on the expenditure side, which is the second surprising fact. The third surprising fact has to do with fiscal federalism, very topical these days. The southern states have a lot of grievance against the Hindi heartland and other states. As you know, famously, D.K. Suresh, who's the brother of D.K. Shivkumar in Karnataka, he thundered and he said, our GST revenues are being taken away by others. If this continues, basically he was threatening secession in terms. Now the question is, what is the origin? Why this grievance? Is it legitimate? And what we find is that actually it is true that there have been transfers from richer to poorer states, but the biggest quote-unquote donor states are not the southern states. They're in fact the western states and Haryana. So in one sense, the grievance is not completely legitimate. But where it is legitimate, what we find is that these transfers, remember in a federal system, we do want, richer states want to transfer money or have to poorer states, because that's part of being a common nation. We do want access to public services for a citizen in Nagaland or Rajasthan to be not very different to a citizen in Hyderabad, in Ranga Reddy district, for example, the richest district in India, or in Tamil Nadu. So that's why we make these transfers. But I think the reason for the grievance, I think, is that these transfers have been rising and rising and rising over time. So it seems like it's like an open-ended, transfer of resources with no limit and no caps. So not only is it rising transfers that are the problem, but it seems to be happening in a context of severe underperformance by the Hindi heartland and overperformance. So it's almost as if this fiscal transfer system doesn't provide good incentives for kind of good behavior, as it were. Underperformance is being rewarded or at least not penalized, and overperformance is kind of being penalized. So that's the way to understand, fiscal federalism and the transfers. So these are three surprising facts. I'll end by talking. So we have a chapter on pathologies. I mean, what are some of the things that characterize the Indian experience? We have about 4 or 5. And I will just touch upon 2, which is what we call my Bapism. So if my Bapism is the default ideology, not just of the Indian state, but of Indian society more broadly, and it has a kind of standard operating procedure complement, which is the love of complexity of the Indian state, the Indian bureaucracy, which has actually created so much damage for India. So I just read out one sentence, what we mean by my Bapism. India's default ideology is statism, best understood in its Indian rendition, My Bap Sarkar or My Bapism. This is more than the narrow ideology of the left with its belief in state-driven industrialization or welfareism. It is more all-encompassing and shared well beyond the narrow elite, a sort of mass ideology that includes the right as much as the left. It connotes the state as provider and protector, refuge and comfort, even if it has also been the apathetic parent, absentee landlord, tormentor, and a Wizard of Oz-like figure, projecting an illusion of power without the actual reality of power. The Indian ecosphere is almost universally my Bapist. What is the standard operating procedure? Complexity. So let me narrate an incident. So when I was chief economic advisor, this was in 2016, I actually went to Bihar to meet the chief minister, Mr. Nitish Kumar. And so my team and I were with him, and he had 2 of his things. I said, dear chief minister, let me ask you a question. And I like to be provocative. How many electricity tariffs do you think Bihar has? The tariff charges to different consumers, different agriculturists and so on. He said, Arvind ji, मुझे मालूम नहीं, पर शायद 4-5 होंगे, 4-5. So I said, नहीं, Nitish ji, और भी ज़्यादा है. And then he had his 2 advisors, and he turned to them and said, बताइए, बताइए. And they said, sir, we think कि, 10 या 11-12 है. So I said, नहीं, sir. Then he said, बुलाइए उनको, phone करके बताइए. And the phone call came back saying, those people, the experts so-called said, oh, maybe there are 20 or 25 tariffs. So I said, नहीं, हो ही नहीं सकता, करीब 100-150 है tariffs. So I went back. To his credit, Mr. Nitish Kumar rang me and said, Arvind ji, you're absolutely right. There are about 100 to 150 tariffs in Bihar. And let me tell you, it's the same in Telangana, almost as bad, not as bad, all over the country. So think of it this way. Electricity is a market. And in a market, you generally want one price. Maybe, sometimes you have to make variations for all kinds of things. But in fact, we have, 100, 150. It's a kind of mind-boggling complexity that exacts so much toll on the economy. Even the Telangana tariff schedule is quite bad. And then in the book, we write about the license Raj, and we write about the fertilizer subsidy regime in the license Raj. And then, believe me, if you were to know what the fertilizer subsidy Raj is, you would say even all the omniscient gods put together cannot come up with this, because the caricature of complexity is the reality. So, and then we cheekily say, we write everything in the past tense and say, if you think this happened in the industrial licensing Raj, I'm sorry, this is the fertilizer subsidy today in 2005. So, and last point I want to end on is this whole, we're talking about complexity, but there's a deep puzzle about the Indian state pathology, which I think relates to my Bapism. So if you take today, I think one of the most sectors that is holding back the Indian economy is the power sector. if you look at China today, where China is way ahead of even the United States and the rest of the world, of course, partly because of technology and AI and all the things that it's doing, but what is the foundation of where it is leading the world is that China has become an electrostate powered by renewable energy. It is because artificial intelligence, EV revolution, everything, data centers, they're electricity guzzlers. And in the US, electricity prices are rising very rapidly because supply is not matching demand. But China is way ahead on that. And India is so far back in terms of the electricity sector and how much it can finance development. But here's the paradox about the electricity sector. I'll just give you, if you take, forget about agriculture, just take electricity to households. In India today, about 60 to 65% of the subsidy provided to households on power goes to the middle class and the rich. It doesn't go to poor consumers. Goes to us. It goes to. So the question is, when you say democracy and socialism, there is nothing about either democracy or socialism that says give 60% of the subsidies to the rich, but this pervades the entire Indian ecosphere. All the states do it, with some exceptions. All the states do it. So there's some deeper pathology, partly my-bapism, which is leading to this kind of, and the same is true of the fertilizer subsidy. It all goes to rich farmers. The same of the MSP regime that we have, elaborate, also goes to. So there's something that is going on here which is kind of eludes full understanding, but which is holding back India tremendously, and I think the time has come to kind of address some of these pathologies.
Okay, we'll come to addressing the pathologies in a minute. Let me start first by trying to unpack a couple of things you said, and I'm going to be far more provocative than I was this morning, because we have a reasonably adult audience here, not just students and academics who can be quite childish. You use the word right at the beginning of your book, precocious, and you use it in many dimensions. Economically precocious. This gives me the impression that you guys have a certain idea of the natural order of things. And I find this difficult to understand. I'm sure you have an explanation. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not necessarily critiquing you. For example, you said in the book that it's remarkably precocious for India to have given universal adult franchise in 1947. What else could they do? I mean, they give it to zamindars? Would they give it to Brahmins? Would they give it only to South Indians? Similarly, when you talk about, being precocious in terms of services, anticipating manufacturing, you seem to have a sort of almost Arthur Lewis kind of natural order of things. First you reduce agriculture, then you bring manufacturing, then you bring services. Can you clarify what you mean by this term precocious? Because I think a number of people are going to be troubled by it when they read your book.
So we are using only precocious not because it is our natural order, but relative to what other countries have done. So it's only in a comparative sense that, look, in most other countries, universal franchise came at much higher levels of literacy and income than India. That is the only sense that we are using. It is not at all. It is just saying, relative to other countries, India decided to give universal franchise, and for very good reasons, as you said. So we are not making a value judgment at all about good. We are just saying it did that and it had consequences. That's the only. So it's more in a comparative sense that, look, across the world, rather than any normative judgment.
I think what Devesh said earlier about why we use a comparative thing is because, any assessment you make has to have a benchmark. And in this sense, that's why it's the international benchmark that we use in a fairly positive, not in a normative sense. However, there were consequences to the precociousness. One is on the economic side, because of having gone straight from agriculture to high-tech services and not having done enough formal manufacturing and low-skill manufacturing, there were huge costs in terms of not providing employment and that's why India's formal sector employment is as low as it is. I think there's to be completely not to be disingenuous. We also use precociousness in terms of the policy choices that were made. For example, emphasizing higher education over basic education, emphasizing welfare and redistribution early on before public goods like infrastructure, health, education, and these two had adverse consequences. So you can't get away from the consequences of these choices. So in that sense, I think it would be disingenuous of us to say that we're not making any normative statements, but implied there is the consequences of these choices have led to outcomes which you have to say were,
Let me follow up on that.
Yeah.
So you're saying that you say on the one hand that South India grew like China. Now, we didn't grow through manufacturing, except Tamil Nadu, right? So we grew with services. Are you saying that had no impact on employment, on welfare, etc., this upsurge we saw in China-like growth in South India? You have some data you quoted.
Yeah. So I think what we find is that, remember that the states that grew had, obviously they were different in terms of the structural transformation. Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, to some extent Maharashtra, did manufacturing. And manufacturing employment and GDP in these states was much higher than the less successful states, but they were not quite at the level of China and Korea. So it's true that therefore we did get growth rates without the kind of things. In a state like Karnataka, of course, via Bangalore, it happened via services. In Haryana, it happened via both manufacturing and services. And of course, in the Kerala case, it was neither agriculture nor manufacturing nor IT services, happened through globalization and export of labor. So the patterns were different, but of course the other commonality, at least for Tamil Nadu and Gujarat with China, is having had the social reform movements from the bottom up. So that the problems of society, of caste and hierarchy and so on, and the poor human development outcomes were addressed earlier and faster. In China via Communist Party ideology, in Tamil Nadu and Kerala via, Narayana Guru and others, in Kerala the social reform movements, the Justice Party, Ramaswamy Naicker in Tamil Nadu. See, Gujarat, the difference is that you got the growth, but you didn't get the similar improvements in human development outcomes because it didn't have these bottoms-up reform movements. And of course, in the Hindi heartland, you neither got the growth nor the human development indicators because you neither had the reform movements and you had very, poor, all kinds of other pathologies that we can talk about.
Great, fantastic. I must say in passing, I'm not expecting a response from you on the South India, Western India thing, that obviously Western India has to transfer more because they get so much. They have the 3 states, the two A's and 1 T. They're all Gujarati, my industrialist friends. So obviously, kuch to dena padega vapis. If I'm going to monopolize airports and destroy GMR and, sort of...
But that goes over the last half century. So the transfers from the West have been true for half century, not just in the last decade.
But Devesh, it is true that they rise rapidly since the late 90s to 2000s. They do rise rapidly.
But before the Modi government came.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Hard. No, it happens 100. Devesh, very important point. It accelerates obviously, but it actually increases when India's growth takes off. That's when the rising transfers happen.
And the house of Tata predates Modi, and so does Ambani. And they're both Gujaratis. Unlike GMR. Okay, so now I have a question for you which has come to me online, and maybe Devesh is the best person to ask this. People reading your book, or reading reviews of your book at least, are saying that you have an extremely static concept of caste. And you've used it almost in a parametric way. You haven't explored sort of the argument that, people are better off in terms of caste discrimination today. That doesn't sufficiently explain what kind of barrier caste presents to the development problem. That is not one of your sort of focal points at all in the book. So in fact, there's a large school of thought, including in this city, which believes that India may have ameliorated caste and we have not annihilated it.
Sorry, consider we have.
Annihilated it, to quote Ambedkar, right? And that sort of consensus on not annihilating things has resulted in outcomes which you don't actually discuss, such as 90% of civil servants being the top three castes. In the end, you may have reservations, but in the end of the pipeline, 90% of Supreme Court judges, it's actually one of the best places we have some caste reform. Almost the entire military, the media, us economists. Difficult for me to think of a Dalit economist, actually. And this is a plaint that has come from my students in this city and other people writing to me. So obviously this is a plaint, and this is your chance to perhaps explore in some length, what your take on caste is, rather than respond to this plaint, and how you would see that fitting into your arguments in the book.
So yes, I mean, it's true that the book is not obsessed with caste. We see it as one of the cleavages. In fact, we point out that what the first backward classes commission said, that the obsession with caste has led to the other major sort of social cleavage in India, gender, being put on the side. All the major caste-based parties, you will see, have almost no female leaders. You don't have to go to the Supreme Court. You have to ask the caste-based parties, where are your female leaders? The first backward classes commission said, the first claim to reservation in India should be for women. It was ignored. The second backward classes, the dissent note by the Dalit member, also discussed. In fact, one of the criteria for backwardness was if there is high female labor force participation, you are more backward. More backward. Ask them. Because they were all male. They were all male. You see, this whole obsession with caste, it is very clear, and we put it, has meant that the other great cleavage, which of course occurs within households and wider society, that ask the parties, the parties, whether Andhra or Bihar or UP, the caste-based, and they have some of the worst gender indicators in themselves. So one could argue that the obsession with caste has meant that you downplay patriarchy. And patriarchy, let us be very clear, is rife no matter which political party, upper caste, lower caste, etc. That is very much. Having said that, we make it clear that what we see in caste is it has moved from terrible to bad, which is a significant improvement, but we have made no claims that it is good. So that these barriers, now the question is, why is it that we show that in government, public sector, as well as in the bureaucracy, compared to what things were in the 50s and 60s, there is enormous change in representation. The reason why you don't have secretaries in the government of India, very few from the lower caste, is that they join late. And so you just, because the refusal of lower caste parties to allow an age limit, which made sense in the 1970s when there were far fewer Dalit students in higher education. We show that the number of Dalits in higher education has increased 45-fold since 1980. So the pool is much deeper and wider than it used to be. But if you insist on having 5 trials, 32, etc., they just are fewer years. And we don't want to deal with that fact. So there are many other factors that are going into this, of which undoubtedly the prejudices continue, all of that. That is undoubtedly true. But all we are saying is that, you know, if you ask this question about equality, let's step back, right? So there's this great book by this Stanford historian that looks around the world on social inequalities and what were the factors that lead to an attenuation of social inequalities. It's never democracy. It's either what he calls the four horsemen, right? It's either revolutions, or it is natural catastrophes like the Black Death in Europe, or it is natural disasters of some sort. You know, there was an earthquake, so, or of course wars, right? World War I, World War II. So if you really want what you're seeking for, Rathin, I think you're pointing that either India needs to have a massive war, or India needs to have a massive revolution, or India needs a massive natural catastrophe. Which of these three would you choose?
Can I just see? I think how to annihilate caste, right, is something that's or something on which there's a raging debate even within the Dalit community itself, right? You have those who say more reservation, more affirmative action on the one hand, but you have people on the other side like Chandraban and Anand Teltumbe who say, no, it's something else. Now, we are not going to resolve that because we're not the experts on that. And so we acknowledge what the drag caste has imposed on India. For example, even the contrast between the southern states, which I just said, and the Hindi heartland, has a lot to do with caste. You know, exactly, and we acknowledge that. And we also, in this chapter on nation building, talk about how measures were taken to address not just caste, but other dimensions of inequality. And so, I mean, for these kind of pragmatic reasons as well as the other things, we felt that, you know, this was not the place to go into a...
If I can add, so what we discuss in the book was historically and going back to Dr. Ambedkar, where he points out, look, what are the two mechanisms through which caste replicates? Occupation and marriage, right? Now, what he saw was that modernity, rapid growth, means you have entirely new caste-neutral occupations coming into the fore. So when you say a truck driver, well, a truck driver is not attached to a caste. There wasn't anything called a truck. It is a class-based, but not a caste-based occupation. So as you grow and have new occupational categories, that relationship between caste and occupation weakens. However, this was, Ambedkar was very clear, unless marriage patterns change, it is impossible. So when you look at the best surveys on attitudes to marriage in India, every single caste, every single religion is opposed to intermarriage. Dalits are as opposed to intermarriage as Brahmins. Hindus are as opposed to intermarriage as Muslims. And that is rooted in society. You have to ask, how are you going to change it? Do you think the state can force people to marry?
You don't change.
Exactly. So that's why I said, either you say the democracy, or you say, if you want these things, you have to use very different ways.
So I think the one last point to say, which we talk about in the book and relates to some of Devesh's earlier work is, see, broadly, social change can happen through social and political mobilization. And to some extent, that has been true for OBCs via reservation, right? But it hasn't spread more broad. I mean, to some extent, Mayawati was... so. Or the other way is that through economic change, you get social change. Now, to the four horsemen of the apocalypse that Devesh said, in India, what we argue is that there was a fifth agent of change, which is economic growth itself. Economic growth changed society, not enough, not as durable, didn't lead to intermarriage because the problems were in society, as Devesh said. But economic growth itself brought about changes, the mobility that happens with economic growth. And second, the delinking of occupation and caste, which economic growth brought about. So I think the whole social change caste is far more complex, and the book touches upon parts of it, but doesn't take it up as a central issue, because this is not, we focus on a lot of things.
That's fine. That's absolutely up to the judgment of the reader whether you're focused on the right things or not. I'm not so sure about the reading of occupation and mobility, but that is obviously why this is such a good book, because it raises the question, and in disagreeing with it, you can perhaps explore it further. Let me move on to my third point, which is mine actually. You've given the Indian private sector a bit of a free pass in this book. I mean, you've said all the right things, that there's crony capitalism, and there's rent seeking and all that. But we don't really have, notwithstanding what people in Hyderabad think or Bangalore think, a sort of robust capitalist class, right? Yet. There's far too much rent-seeking going on. There's a lot of feudalism involved in the nature of capitalism. And the public sector, which you so love to decry, perhaps, was a response to that. I mean, certainly I happen to know, because I've studied it carefully, that bank nationalization happened because the people running banks and insurance companies in this country in the mid-1960s were a bunch of scoundrels who were
And LIC as well.
and everything. That man with 7 mistresses, Dalmia, and that sort of thing, right? So, and what it did bring about, therefore, was a sense of confidence in the financial system, and therefore that was necessary. This is not to justify PM Modi's interventions, which have nothing to do with this whatsoever. So that's my takeaway. Now, obviously, you will think, I hope you will think differently, but to help the audience understand, what is your take on the Indian private sector in this journey that you described?
You want to start? Okay.
See, you're absolutely right that the weakness, if you want to call it, of the Indian bourgeoisie in the 1950s, 60s was a major impetus for pushing for the public sector, right? But at some point, the driver becomes the brake, right? The way, and Arvind will talk about it more, the way the license Raj really squeezed the domestic private sector, and in fact favored large incumbents, as we know from the different reports. So the question was, did the weakness of Indian capitalism, was it inherent to the capitalists, or was it induced by the state action itself, right? Now, and I think reasonable people can disagree, cause, effect, etc., etc. But it is also the case that one of the things we don't take up, we just mentioned, but because we were running out of space, it was becoming too large, is, why is, say, entrepreneurship, for instance, so unevenly distributed across the country, right? Is there a sociological explanation? I grew up in Calcutta, and most of Bengal's business community was from outside the state. And when capital fled Bengal, there wasn't domestic capital or capitalists or entrepreneurs that could pick up that slack, right? Is it something to do about an elite culture that values other things rather than this? These are, but I think, I think, and Arvind might disagree, that the degree to which there is state control, state management of the private sector, and frankly, across many states, just extortion, especially for election financing, has meant that it's not easy for entrepreneurs who simply don't want to pay up to actually flourish. It is a big challenge, and we have to face up like to that. So again, what is cause, what is effect, is an open
I want
question.
to sharpen that question for you, Arvind. If you could focus on 1991. You know, we were supposed to have this efflorescence of entrepreneurship. We were supposed to have all these things being addressed by, liberalization, etc., etc. And what we seem to have ended up with is three oligarchs. So, how do you see the evolution of capitalism since 1991 in the context of the questions that you raise in the book?
Yeah, see, a couple of thoughts, right? I mean, given that we really embarked on a version of capitalism only after 1991, Chauvelin Lai said about the French Revolution, it's kind of too early to tell, right? I mean, it's an early phase, and certainly the legacy of squashing the private sector, I think still lingers, and therefore any assessment of the private sector should not overlook, the dominant. But that being said, it is true, and this is a point that I thought Devesh would make, that if you look at the innovation done by Indian private sector firms, it's pitifully small, one. The second case in point is that if you look at the IT sector, which has been so successful, I mean, we have not really created the kinds of things that China has created, et cetera, et cetera. And, we're still in this GCC, writing cheap code, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, I think the private sector has something to answer for as well. Now, of course, in the last 5-10 years, the whole landscape now, to some extent, is being dominated by, a few big firms. And therefore, the question of, whether, capitalism is allowing the true entrepreneurs to come in is going to be impacted by this. And, I mean, I use the term stigmatized capitalism to say what we have here. And I think going forward, unless we address that, there's going to be a problem. But let me give you one kind of final cautionary note. Take the Ambani Group, for example, right? We know that the Ambani Group and the Adani Group, and others, by the way, receive a lot of regulatory favors from the state. And unlike the chaebols of Korea, when General Park said, I will create, allow these large conglomerates, there were 2 or 3 differences between those and what happened in India. He said, first, these are going to be almost sector-specific conglomerates, 1. And 2, I will give you favor, but I will impose discipline on you because you have to meet the market test of competitiveness and productivity by exporting. And in some cases, he even shot entrepreneurs who didn't deliver. In the Indian case, I think the 2 major differences are these large conglomerates are actually like octopuses. I mean, they just don't just dominate one sector, they dominate a number of sectors, and therefore you have to worry about the impact they have on other true capitalism, as it were, capitalists. The second is that they operate mostly in regulated, non-tradable sectors where it is difficult to really say, have you met the market test of efficiency and productivity, much more difficult in non-traded sectors. It is true that maybe the ports are doing reasonably well. Maybe it is true that, and maybe it is true that, the democratization of access to data has been a success story. And just the kind of deeper point here, that I think society does view these with some ambivalence. I mean, I don't want to get too sociological about it, is that the famous wedding that happened, you would think that Indian society would be in uproar over this exhibition of display, this kind of absolutely crude display of wealth, almost a wanton display of wealth. I mean, I don't want to name names, but Pratap Mehta wrote a piece on that, which said, Indian society, not even is not ambivalent, kind of also took pride that Indian capital could have Beyonce coming here to perform for Indians. So like we were. So I think it's kind of a bit more complicated. So don't see the last point I would say, yeah. But the last point I would say is that just because we are maybe ambivalent about capitalism, doesn't mean we should stop asking the accountability questions of the public sector. We shouldn't go overboard on this. So take a public sector banking, for example. I mean, if you look at the data, Arun Jaitley once said, Arvind, if you propose privatization of even one bank, 535 out of 538 would say no way. So there is a overwhelmingly bipartisan consensus against public sector bank, which is kind of not right in some ways, right? I mean, there is a sense in which, because remember, if you look at the data, while public sector banking, we haven't done anything against it, people have voted with their feet. If you look at the data, in 1990, 90 to 95% of credit and deposits share was accounted for by the public sector. In 2025, it's about 60%. So we've had de facto by people voting with their feet and with their money, but I think it is something that we should evaluate more carefully.
Yeah, well, think about why it's not 10%. There must be a logical reason why people keep putting money in public sector banks. It's not all linear.
No, I think the point that I forgot that Arvind added, it is striking how much India is an outlier in the low share of the private sector in R&D expenditure. In R&D expenditure.
R&D.
Yeah, among large countries, in China, which you think is statist, and in the US, the vast majority of R&D expenditure is by the private sector. In India, it is the state.
And very little there.
Yeah, so the levels are very low and the distribution is completely skewed. You have to, if you look at, say, the Ambanis or the Adanis, compare them with their Korean counterparts, the number of international patents filed is like a ratio of 100 to 1. The vast majority of international patents filed from India are filed by multinationals which have R&D labs in India.
Especially Hyderabad.
But, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Pune, Chennai, etc. The question is, why does the Indian private sector, what are the broader conditions in which they work that, because we know that without R&D you cannot get innovation, and we know that innovation is the driver if you want to be at the frontier. Now, is it because there are enough rents that you can get that you don't need this? Is it that there are other ways you can make money? If I invest in property or whatever, you don't need, you need to play the system. You need to be innovative in who you bribe, but you don't need to be innovative in innovation per se. So that is, I think, a very clear indictment of the Indian private sector, which I think should be held to account on its absolutely meager commitment to research and innovation.
Interesting fact here. I discovered this yesterday in Bangkok. The biggest investor in healthcare R&D in this country is not Apollo. It's not Pfizer. It's the Tata Trust. That's a not-for-profit, which is doing the biggest investment in healthcare and health sector R&D expenditure. Okay, now I want to open it up. But before that, I want you really, because it's a corporate city, and this is the hub of this corporate city, I want you to be corporate for just this 1 minute. And in your prognosis, or what is to follow or what could follow, can you do that in bullet points, 1 minute each? Pick which ones you want to pick.
What do you mean by?
Your last chapter, looking forward. bullet points of the most important things you think people should interrogate you on in the Q&A that's going to follow.
Yeah, so just very briefly, in our forward-looking chapter, we say, after having written this book, everyone will say, give us a list of 3 or 4 or 5 or top things, and we studiously desist from doing that.
Why?
Why? 2 reasons. One, Devesh will have his own list, I will have my list, Rathin will have his list. We will never agree on that. Point 1. Point 2, if you look at the retrospective gaze on India, what happened, all the major changes that happened were either because of crises, 66, 91, or because of technology, Green Revolution, IT revolution, or because, as I said, some intended and unintended consequences of economic growth itself. So it's like, that imbues a certain humility about saying the big changes come about because of these reasons. However, what we say is that we do have one prescription, and that is do no harm. And what do we mean by that? We mean by that the following, that the major and early and persistent successes of India were democracy, nation building, strong institutions, pluralism, and cooperative federalism, trust between the center and the states. We are in slight danger of losing many of these things. And these, especially something like cooperative federalism, are critical to almost any problem we want to solve going forward requires that. And if that trust between the center, whatever, because of over-centralization, or majoritarian rule, religious, whatever, so do no harm, especially to the great successes that we had.
I don't have to add. I mean, I think part of the thing when you write a book like this, you realize that if I say India needs to improve human capital, is that news like to you? The Indian state should be more effective. Is that news to you? If I say Delhi needs to reduce pollution, we know all of these things. It's not, we don't have anything outstandingly novel. We know that the hard part is not the what, but the how. Right? And the how, almost always, as Arvind has pointed out, is not because some brilliant academics have some brilliant insights. It's because there are large structural forces, whether it's crises, whether it's technology, or you have, by chance, a particular happenstance change in sort of leadership that is just different. It's not because Arvind and I wrote a book that is a nice book and it has some prescriptions. We should be very humble about that.
So just empirical fact, full disclosure, we've been writing this book for about 4 or 5 years. But before this, in 2019, Devesh and I wrote a short book focusing exclusively on what needs to be done. I'm so glad we abandoned that for exactly the reason that Devesh said, that there's nothing new to say. It's almost as if, for example, we annihilate caste, as if, this encrusted civilizational feature could be changed overnight through some policy prescription that we come up with. So it's a humility. It's also looking at the experience, and I think frankly the hard task, if we don't do serious damage to what we have already, that itself will be a great achievement because we. So I just want to read out the last sentence of the book, which, if with your permission, which adds to this. So we say, yet this revolution of rising, even mutinous expectations will be frustrated and turn dangerous if the national project obsesses with the past that can never be settled to the neglect of the only object of collective agency, namely the future, India's and the world's, that can be rendered promising, especially for its youth. India's real achievements of democracy, order, federalism, and nation building should not be squandered. Averting that tragedy is the matter of collective urgency. A modicum of success will allow a sixth of humanity, nearly 1.5 billion aspirational and entrepreneurial Indians, to take up the important task of seizing and shaping the future.
Perfect. So that's excellent. Thank you very much for, I think, what has been a fairly absorbing conversation. As a teacher, I know from eye contact when people are paying attention and when they're checking their phones, and I'm quite gratified to see that not much bandwidth was used in this hour. So thank you very much, both of you. I'm going to open the floor now, and I'm going to go systematically. Where do all the shy people sit? Far away? So you'll wait for some time? Okay. Anyone there wants to ask a question? Or make a comment?
I have a question on the, when you said that India's certain portion actually grew as much as China did, but when you do the calculation, it's the typical Pareto principle that, the 20-80 ratio typically overpowers the remaining 80-20 contribution. But when you look at the overall Hindi heartland contribution, fall back compared to the rest, I would love to understand whether the start point, which is 1947, was the IQ, EQ levels, etc., and the overall educational quotient of the Hindi heartland as similar as the states, South Indian states that contributed to a significant economic boom. Was it genuinely a level playing field, or was there so much of disparity in all of these equal parameters where there were so many caste wars, regional wars, etc. in the Hindi heartland, and because of that, it was not a level playing field to start with at the first instance?
Great. We can take one more question from
So
this
that
side.
was basically where I was heading as well. So the Tamil Nadu model of development, which was Periyar movement and a religious to a degree, and then a casteist to a significant degree. So is that a great catalyst for growth? Which is like, so if you say Tamil Nadu versus Bihar or something, they're diametric opposites, right? Periyar literally made a level playing field and made it very meritocratic. So is a question then that the alignment into religion and caste, which may happen again now in the current scenario again, is that does that correlate negatively with growth? Is what I'm trying to ask. We both are trying to ask that.
Arvind, I'll start with the second two, and then you can take the others.
I was for the second.
Yeah. And look, I think there was one, we talked about social movements, but there was one fundamental handicap that large parts of the Hindi heartland and Bengal had, which was the land settlement under the British. The zamindari system, in the way the land settlement was done, created a very pernicious feudal structure in much of UP, Bihar, and Bengal. There's a very nice paper by Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer which points out that because we know of the famines, the disasters that created for what was the Bengal presidency under the British, the land settlements in the Punjab and in South India were different. They were more egalitarian. So that feudal structure had very deep, long-term negative consequences. And then that also meant that having social movements was also harder because you had this entrenched feudal power structure, which is much harder to break. So, of course, when land reforms were attempted in the 50s, some modest things happened. Bengal, after the CPM came back to power, had some more. But by and large, we know that these were thwarted because, as has been pointed out by many others, the Congress party, its own elite base was among rural landlords and the landed elite. So this is one case where we point out no democracy has ever had successful land reforms, period. land reforms around the world have only happened after revolutions. Absolutely the case. I mean, but I'm saying serious land reforms. You've had 10-year relation, but redistribution of land on a massive scale we saw it, East Asian success. One of the key criteria was when the Americans occupied after World War II, Japan, Korea, it was under them that the land reforms happened. Same in Taiwan, because you had a new group coming in, Chiang Kai-shek, when they fled, they had land reform. But again, it was in a scenario where you basically had a complete change in the political regime, lock, stock, and barrel, right? So the North had, in that way, it had another handicap, which was the freight equalization policy, which really handicapped Bengal and Bihar, because it meant that mineral resources that were key, coal, iron ore, etc., which were in Bihar and Bengal, were available at equal. So the comparative advantage, it could not be taken. And of course, the freight equalization policy ends in the early 90s, but by that time, of course, things had already sort of entrenched around. So I think these two things, there's no doubt that the playing field was not level for large parts of the North and East.
So in addition to what Devesh said, your question was there a difference even at the starting point, right? And if you look at the, say, per capita GDP and broadly the human development indices in 1960, there was, generally the southern states and West Bengal were better off than the Hindi heartland. But the margin was, it's not minuscule, but not huge. What happens is that this kind of differential in, per capita GDP and this actually broadly continues till about 1980, 1990. The big divergence between the Hindi heartland and the South happens after the mid-80s. Why? Because essentially in the first 30 years, whatever the initial differences were, they were kept in check because politically, fiscally, and policy-wise, there was total centralization. Planning meant centralization, which meant limited agency for the states. So when around 85, 90, political decentralization took place, policies became more decentralized, fiscally it became more decentralized, then states had agency, and then whatever the differences in capability, human capital, policies, that came into effect. And that's when the explosion happened. So initial advantage, yes, kept in check by the policies of centralization and socialism. Once those are removed, the agency of states gets reflected. And so, for example, West Bengal, deteriorates dramatically over this because of what West Bengal did, despite its head start initially. Similarly, Punjab started well, was the fastest growing state. In 1987, it had the highest per capita GDP, but then collapsed thereafter because of what happened in Punjab. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that there are initial conditions, but they were kept in check, and once they acquired agency is when this divergence happened. So that's on that question. On the China-India question, if I can, I'm not sure how exactly what the question was, but remember that by and this is one of the things we show in the book, 1950, India and China are roughly in the same position, roughly, on per capita GDP, agricultural production, human development index, roughly similar, not exactly. By 1962, which is when the Great Leap Forward happens, many of these indicators are better for India than for China. But by 1980, that everything gets reversed, and China is already way ahead of India, especially on human capital indicators, health, and agricultural yields. And so when the liberalization happens in 1978 in China and then 1991, it's not so much, I mean, obviously the manner in which and the pace in which the two countries liberalized was somewhat different, and we can go into it. But that initial difference also played a key part because, Chinese human capital was much better. So in a sense, the human capital, the only comparable states in India with those kinds of human capital were the southern states, and it's kind of not surprising that they did as well as China. So I think the thing to understand, what I want to impress upon you is that, yes, after 1978, both countries liberalized, and then the wedge, really divergence in performance happened. But already by 1980, there was a big difference. And that's why when people kind of, say the performance of India in the first 30 years was not too bad, the comparison with China shows that no, it was pretty bad, not just in terms of growth, but in terms of all the human capital indicators already. And remember, and the final point I would say is that in that period, especially between the 50s and mid-1970s, about 20 years, China had very little economic order. There was chaos in terms of the Great Leap Forward. And politically and culturally, there was chaos and disorder. So despite the disorder, China leapt ahead already by 1980.
Can I just also point out that this flip is not just China and India. I can think of 3 countries since the mid-70s that have flipped like this. The first is, most obvious one is South Korea. The second, more recently, is Vietnam. I was absolutely gobsmacked to see that Vietnam's per capita income is now close to $5,000. We are still at 3. And they were much poorer than us in 1988. And the third is in our neighborhood, the country that North Indians love to hate. It's called Bangladesh, which is exactly what West Bengal should aspire to be like Bangladesh. They've done better than us on per capita income, on human development. So China was not exceptional in terms of this flip happening.
But note that Vietnam, Korea and China, all 3 had devastating wars.
Yeah. I'm beginning to think you're a revolutionary.
Which completely wiped out the existing landed elite in these 2 countries. Yeah. The question is, you know how expensive they were in human lives?
But they're dead now, isn't it?
That's one way to look at it. But ask those who were killed in the process if they appreciate that.
So you're saying we should be okay because we didn't kill too many people, so it's good that we're not doing as well as them. Good.
No, so that's...
I think I would, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think we love outcomes, but we want to blind ourselves about the processes. Okay? These were extremely bloody processes. I mean, if you look at the death toll of the Korean War as a fraction of the population, the Vietnam War, if you apply that to India, that's about 50 to 80 million people would be dead. The question is that a price we think is worth paying?
No, I would put it slightly differently. I mean, I would not even say these are kind of, what would you prefer, one over the other? I think you just have to recognize that maybe the two go hand in hand. And therefore, different countries make different choices on these things. And, one can't get away from, China, China is a bit surprising because despite all this chaos, the human development indicators still improved, but they did pay a high price. I mean, the Great Leap Forward, they say now up to 50 million people could have died in the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution, another 5 to 7 million. So the human costs were huge, and I don't think, therefore, that's why when people say, oh, would you rather have democracy or autocracy, it's not it's not an easy question to answer.
Okay, we have time for one quick round of questions. I'm going to focus on the center of the room. Yes, please.
Over the years, we've seen that the population, they have an aging population. Most of their economies are dead. Don't you think that it is important for us as Indians to have a different parameter, though we have one global parameter which we are measuring ourselves against, but shouldn't we have some other parameter where we are actually measuring the growth of the country, whether it is in different governments, different states, whatever we are talking about? GDP per capita, is it a real reflection of how we are performing, or do we need another parameter, another perhaps a measure, a metric to measure what we are doing?
Okay. Any more questions here? Or comments? Yes, please.
We know that 80% of the youth are unemployable like that and all. Like when government needed efficiency and all, it has partnered with the corporates. We have a huge talent pool of all consultants and all. Did it ever occur to anybody advising the Prime Minister that why don't we just, when we are not competent, put a invitation for all the IIMs, IITs, all the, alumni associations. We want to, measure the percentage of the graduates who are earning more than the minimum threshold of, taxation. What is the purpose of useless education that does not allow the graduate to earn beyond the minimum threshold of taxation? Do the people in the policy makers, do they have common sense or not? That is my, it has been a question since a long time. Now I got an opportunity, and sir also asked to ask provocative questions. Okay. And like a given, now we are at the age of startups, artificial intelligence, everything and all. Any policy, if it is a deep fake policy, we are going to use ChatGPT and all to evaluate compared to the global benchmarks, whether our leaders and the policy advisors, just the way Deloitte, all these, found to be like using ChatGPT or inappropriately like that policy. There is a policy hallucination that is happening. How do we resolve that? I have some questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. But remember, we are already ahead in the game. We have a non-biological Prime Minister. So we are streets ahead. Okay, any other questions here? Yeah.
I have one more.
Where's that?
Hi. Over here.
Over there and then I'll come to you. Yeah? Okay, we'll take 4. Okay, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kiran. So a word that I see being tossed around a lot these days is dystopian. And certainly, like the example you gave, certain wedding definitely made us feel very dystopian and feels like end stage capitalism is right there at the doorstep. So I'm looking for some advice as individual citizens. What are some pillars that we can cultivate to maintain our sovereignty in end stage capitalism?
I'll answer 2 and then leave the thing to Devesh. So let me start backwards. So we did find surprises on human development, and let me tell you what the surprises were. What is not surprising is how poorly we did, certainly until 1990. But what did certainly surprise us, and that's what motivates the human capital chapter, is that we actually did reasonably well on some indicators and didn't do as well on others. And there's a kind of pattern to that. Let me give you 2 examples here. Enrollment, after 1990 today, 100% in primary education, we reached 100% enrollment. But learning, if anything, we've actually, and all this is in a cross-country comparative sense, we've not done very well, actually done quite poorly. Similarly, infant mortality, we've done reasonably well, but child stunting, we haven't done very well. Take life expectancy, done very well, but nutrition reflected in heights, we've not done very well. So then the question is, how do you explain this pattern? And the way we try and explain this, it's not fully satisfactory, is that many of the things that improve the quality of life, like take learning, for example. Learning happens not just in the school, but also at home. And so society has to be involved in some of these outcomes. And in fact, Devesh, in a paper earlier that he wrote, spoke about how these kinds of things are co-produced between the state and society. So if society is weak, some of these outcomes are. The second pattern we observe is that many of the things that we do poorly on are actually within the purview of the states. So state governments, in fact, have been, because, and this goes back to Ambedkar, states governments are closer to society. Society is more problematic. Therefore, state governments are able to deliver less. And that's so what. That's on your question. I'll take the question on per capita GDP. See, I think there's a tendency to dismiss growth and per capita GDP growth as kind of, oh, what does it mean? It means nothing, etc., etc. It does mean a lot. What it says is that the average GDP per capita says what is the average standard of living. It doesn't measure distribution, and of course you need to incorporate that, but it does measure some standard of living, and which is comparable across countries, especially if you adjust it in a certain way. It is a meaningful indicator, point number one. Point number two is that growth is very important because growth gives you the opportunity to improve other indicators as well. In India, for example, it's actually true that educational outcomes increased because of economic growth for two reasons. The state got more resources because of growth to spend on health and education. But more importantly, when growth took off, the returns to education increased. So parents then said, the state system might be bad, we will get our kids education and send them to private school, private tuition if necessary. So that's why growth is very important. The last point is that, of course, per capita GDP and growth are not everything. You also need to take into account, for example, at least things like human development indicators, like which measures the quality of life. Are you healthy? Do you have access to services? Are your children learning? Is the air quality good? So one has to have a holistic picture, but that doesn't mean that GDP per capita or growth are, somehow you can dismiss them as irrelevant or unimportant indicators.
So just one small point on human capital. One of the consistent issues we've seen over 100 years, the first reports on this are in the 1920s, is how much we have over-invested in higher education. In the mid-1920s, India had more college-going students than France, when its literacy rate was 10%, right? Exactly. And way more than Japan, which had already. Between 2000 and 2024, India started 4 new colleges a day, every day, including weekends, over the past quarter century. Now you can ask, who are the faculty? What are the students learning? And what are we actually producing, and what are we pretending that these students are learning, right? Relative to its per capita income, India is a complete outlier in its high gross enrollment ratio. At some point, and I won't tell you which government, I was asked to look at the document for higher education and to give my feedback. If I took out higher education, replaced it with fertilizer plants, and replaced students with urea, it could have been you could have just said it. It was that mechanical, right? So we really, every political party has, I think, collectively worked to destroy higher education. And that, I think, to me, if I were to ask, that I've always felt India has only one thing in real excess, that is people. And we've done a dismal job in investing in people, whether it's education or health.
Arvind? So just the last 2 questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer some of the questions. We'll take it up in... and some of the questions were also quite too profound, and I think we need to understand them better. On the question of why do they do the public sector, I think one thing one has to be a bit careful about in this and understand the history, that after the boom of the 2000s, when we had all this infrastructure building, and then we had the post-global financial crisis collapse, we had what was what we characterized as the twin balance sheet challenge, where banks were short, the public sector, but the private infrastructure companies were in deep trouble, and those were the problems. So at that stage, in order to revive the economy, it was felt that you needed public spending and public infrastructure spending. So that's why what Devesh said earlier, whereas although we've added many more or a lot of firms, they are mostly in infrastructure. And at that point, the PPP model was believed to have failed. The banking system was not lending. Therefore, the government felt that it had to invest more. And that's why the whole, especially roads was a big impetus. But that doesn't explain the infusion in MTNL, which I think has to do with the old pathologies of, the labor unions, my-bapism, and all. I mean, basically the inability to, exit, as it were, from this, which has been a perennial problem. On the last question of, having studiously said that we will not give any recommendations, you phrased the question in a more tricky way, and Devesh will probably disagree with me on this, but I have felt that if I were Prime Minister of India today, or at least a few years ago, I would just do one thing. I mean, I would try and revive our labor-intensive manufacturing sector by, doing everything possible, including working closely with all the states to try and revive labor-intensive manufacturing, especially in the wake of the China plus one shock. All the investment that was leaving China, there was no reason why Vietnam should have, or Indonesia should have got all of it, and whether we, and it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of coordination, but I would have gone on mission mode to say that this is the last opportunity to do labor-intensive export manufacturing. How do we get that going? It would have been at least my obsession if I had been Prime Minister.
Well, we certainly got a recommendation out of him. And that's partly because, you see, I told you, Hyderabad is a results-oriented city. So I'm sure you'll read the book. But I think the most encouraging thing about this book is it encourages us to think and disagree. And therefore, I suppose the fact that the authors did not provide recommendations allows a lot of us, not necessarily my generation, but certainly ones after, to come up with some, based on the information, and if you like, the sort of SITREP, the situation report that you get in this book. So thank you very much for furthering that conversation. We have been delighted to host you in Hyderabad. Thank you for choosing the forum as a place to come and interact with us. And have a good time in polluted Delhi. Welcome out of dynamic India, back to Delhi Darbar for you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you very much, everyone.